like high school and was like, math is hard. I'm not doing this. I'm not even joking. I got up to like calc level 2, but man, it's hard.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to hit your level of incompetence in higher math. My daughter was a math major, and the courses she took, was amazing, but she either understood the class or didn't. And her grade didn't necessarily correlate whether she understood the class or not. So classes where she was totally lost, she did well, and classes where she felt like she understood it, she didn't do well.
That's the story of my academic career, limited as it was. But hey, we're live.
Yeah. Hey, welcome everybody to Agree to Argue. My name is Fuzz Rana. I'm a biochemist and a Christian apologist. I work for an organization called Reasons to Believe, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Steve McRae. Oh, you want to tell me about me, I guess, for a second? Yeah, I'm not a biochemist. However, I have a little bit of background in science. I'm known around YouTube for being around the great debate community and have had Fuzz Rana on my channel numerous times to talk about all kinds of interesting subjects, which basically we're going to try to apply over on this channel.
Yeah, well, I'm impressed with your philosophical acumen, Steve. So we may be talking past each other from time to time, but that's okay. We'll do our best not to. This is going to be really, I think, a show unlike what many people actually expected, because the title is provocative. It's Agree to Argue, but the point of the show is that we're going to come together as two people that hold very different worldviews, but we're friends with one another, and we want to, through this program, develop even a deeper friendship. And we want to agree to argue with one another about really very important topics, but do it in a way that demonstrates a respect and that we can actually be friends, even though we disagree with one another on very important, substantial issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people have this misconception when they hear the word argument that they think it has to be some kind of adversarial thing, or it has to be some kind of infighting, and it's completely not. I definitely think that when we have an argument, it's actually just two people trying to either persuade the other person or just promoting what they believe is to be the case, what they believe to be the facts. Not necessarily some kind of formal, structured argument, not necessarily some kind of deductive argument, but just a person who says, "This is what I believe. These are what I believe to be the case. This is what I think is the factual matter to be had," and they relate it to somebody. And so you can actually agree with people and have some kind of argument, because you're just basically relating positions that you both have. And we don't have to agree on them, but we're not necessarily going to disagree on a lot of stuff either, because I've talked to you a lot and we probably agree on substantial things, but we disagree on substantial things. And hopefully this show can kind of be a dialectic synthesis between the two and kind of figure out what meeting of the minds could we have.
Well, it's amazing, because sometimes, even though when people actually do have substantial disagreements, it's remarkable that there's many times places of surprising common ground. Just a few weeks ago, I had the privilege of being invited to participate in a virtual salon with key members of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, and I've written a book called Humans 2.0, where I kind of offer a critique of transhumanism from a Christian worldview perspective. And as we were engaging one another on transhumanism, it was remarkable, actually, how much I agreed with many of these people that at first blush you would think there would be no opportunity to agree with whatsoever. So it sometimes my point is, sometimes the place where there's common ground is remarkable and surprising as you begin to discuss differences with one another.
Yeah, I have that book, by the way. But yeah, I think a lot of people have this weird misconception, when I think it kind of relates to tribalism a little bit, that if you're in a certain group or certain tribe, I guess you can say, that you have to agree with them wholeheartedly, and you can't give the a person from another group any kind of quarter, right? So especially when it relates to like Christians versus like non-Christians, which, by the way, happens to be a topic that we're discussing tonight. But a lot of people think, well, if you give a Christian ground, if they have a good argument, you're somehow like lessening your own position. I think that's kind of a awkward way to have a discussion. If a person has a good argument, they have a good argument. If they have a bad argument, they have a bad argument. It shouldn't matter what group they belong to, what they're espousing. It should be based upon the merits of the discussion and the argument that they're being profited alone.
Well, and that's particularly true. I find, sadly, from a Christian perspective, I think so many Christians are afraid that somebody is going to come along and undermine their faith with either philosophical or scientific arguments, and therefore feel like it's even a greater threat for them to acknowledge that maybe somebody who's coming at things from a non-Christian perspective may actually have a point, may actually, have something of value.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with saying, "Hey, look, I don't necessarily have the same positions you have, but you make a good argument. I don't know how to really defeat that argument right now, but let me get back to you." I see that happen frequently where somebody says, "Hey, this Christian cannot be right merely because they're Christian, even though that they might have an argument that actually is correct." Same thing with an atheist or a non-Christian. There's a lot of people that have decent arguments that I think a lot of people just say, "Look, by fiat, you're wrong. I can't explain why you're wrong, but I'm just going to say that you're wrong," rather than just saying, "Hey, I don't know enough about this argument to determine whether it's right or wrong. I'll look into it. Maybe I'll get back to you on it." But you can't say that somebody has a bad argument merely because you're not understanding what the argument's about, because some of these arguments can be very, very complicated. They're very complex arguments. So I wouldn't think offhand that somebody right off the bat who's just getting involved in some of these things are going to know what people are talking about when they're talking about ontological arguments, or they're talking about, irreducible complexity. A lot of people are not going to have that background to understand those things, which is fine. You just say, "Look, maybe it's a good argument, maybe it's not. I'm not in a position to evaluate it." And I think a lot of people are afraid to do that because it makes them look weak, they think. And I don't think it does. I think just the opposite. I think it makes them look stronger to say, "Look, I just don't have the tool set right now to, really evaluate that argument. But you know what? Maybe one day I will."
Yeah, well, and in that spirit, of course, we want people to be involved in the program through chat. There'll be a time where people can offer their comments and their Q&A that will engage. But we want to maintain a code of conduct that's in the spirit of the program. And so we really are encouraging people to engage the ideas. Let's not stoop to name calling or to demonizing one another, but let's be willing to engage the arguments. It's perfectly fine to ask tough questions or challenging questions, or make, again, challenging comments to the differing perspectives and the differing opinions that you hear. But we want everyone to operate really, with the same spirit that hopefully you and I will always engage with one another, and that is a civil discourse, and of course, no profanity, no obscenities, things like that. And then one other thing too that's kind of fun is that we are actually going to have a giveaway that's going to be taking place, where people who are watching the show can actually win Agree to Argue swag. So we've got a bunch of really cool mugs that we're going to be giving away, and some other items. I guess there's, let's see, what else are we giving away here? Let's see, stickers, notebooks, and mugs. And you just have to go to agreetoargue.com/contest, and that'll tell you how you can enter. And there's a number of different ways you can enter into a drawing to win this, the cool giveaways that we have. And the more times that you enter, obviously the greater your chances of winning. So we invite people to do that. And also, of course, we've got the mandatory social media handles as well. So it's Agree to Argue. And so you can follow us on Twitter and friend us or like us on Facebook, and I guess follow us on Instagram. So Steve, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, I think we we had, it's funny when we were doing a lot of prep for this show, and it's been almost like a year in the making. We had a lot of topics come up, and I think that the first topic that we decided to kind of set the stage for everything is basically going over why it's not so simple to say that somebody's either Christian or an atheist. I think there's a huge landscape to be had in terminology. And one of the things that I'm known for is I write a blog, 3am Philosophy, where I've discussed a lot of these topics in great detail, dealing with epistemology. And I don't think a lot of the Christian community per se has been exposed to these types of things. And so they're under the same mindset that I see with the atheist community a lot, that look, you're either one or the other. I mean, you're either a Christian or an atheist, which anybody who's ever known anything about an argument is, if you have one defeater to an argument, your argument is wrong. I mean, all it takes is one One example, if I say, hey, all swans are black, or sorry, all swans are white, and I find, black swan, right? No black swan fallacy, then obviously that is not a true premise, right? So I'm a defeater to that argument. I'm not a Christian and I'm not an atheist, which I think a lot of people that probably follow reasons to believe are not familiar with that, right? They think that, oh, look, if you're not a Christian, then clearly you must be an atheist, and that's not the case in philosophy. Now, there's a lot of atheist groups out there that use the terminology differently, and they're more than welcome to. I think a lot of people, for some reason, they'll think that I hold to some kind of prescriptivist views, which I don't. I'm actually a descriptivist, but I hold to more philosophical terminologies. And so when I'm describing myself, I describe myself as a non-believer or a non-theist, uh, but I'm agnostic, which basically means that I don't have a position either way. I don't hold the proposition that God exists is true, and I don't hold the proposition that God exists is false. And I think a lot of people have been somehow indoctrinated to use terminology a different way, a stipulative like way, and that's fine. Again, I use stipulative terms quite frequently. A matter of fact, Fuzz, just on Twitter the day, I used a stipulative term that I think you actually liked, right? You remember what it was?
Yeah, yeah. It was a non-transferable. Uh,
Non-transportable justification.
that's right,
Right.
non-transportable
Yeah,
justification.
and the reason why I termed that is because I wanted to convey a concept. I wanted to convey something that said, "Oh, look, if you hear this term, what is it kind of conveying?" And I think that when I explained to you, you're like, "Oh, it makes sense." And for me, for example, I'm not going to say that I'm Christian because I don't believe, Christianity per se, right? But I'm not going to say I'm an atheist because I don't hold the belief that there are no gods. So those terms don't really apply properly to me. Now, other people can use it any way they want, but I think a lot of people neglect the whole varied landscape of this gradient of terms that people use to be a little more precise on what their beliefs are, like theological and cognitivist, ichtheist, or there's a whole slew of positions: agnosticism, soft agnosticism, weak atheism, soft atheism. There's a lot of degrees to be had. And I think a lot of people are not exposed to philosophy in a way that they see the beauty of having granularity, because I don't want to be lumped in to the people that don't have the same positions as me, right? If somebody says, hey, look, Fuzz, gods are impossible, and they're an atheist, I'm going to be like, well, I don't espouse those views, right? So I don't want to be held to the same terminology as somebody who takes those viewpoints.
So, just to help those people that are looking at engaging people uh, from a non-theist perspective, why is the term non-theist preferred again as opposed to atheist? I think you touched on this.
Well, it's not a matter of being preferred. Like non-theist is really a nondescript term, right? It really doesn't tell you much except that somebody who doesn't believe there's a God, but it just follows naturally from logic. If you have a theist, then the complement set of anything that's not a theist would be a not theist, right? Or non-theist. So it follows naturally from logic, but it really doesn't tell you much. Just like saying that you're a theist doesn't really tell me much. Sure, it tells me that you believe there's a God, but there's a lot of different gods out there. I mean, are you a Christian? Are you Jewish? Are you Hindu? It doesn't really give me any specificity. And so just by saying that I'm a non-theist, it doesn't really give away my actual positions. But somebody who's either a theist or they're not a theist, right? I mean, that's just the basic logic. And so when people try to use the terminology that all non-theists must be atheist, that's when they start getting into semantic issues. And I have again on my blog why those lead to some kinds of ambiguity and
Right.
equivocation issues.
Yeah, you wrote a great blog that I enjoyed reading called, was it God and Gumballs?
God and gumballs, yeah.
That was actually really very helpful to me in terms of understanding, I think, your position in really what is the difference between agnosticism and atheism. So, and I think your point was, look, if I've got this gumball machine and you're asking me, you know, are the number of gumballs in the machine odd or even, if I'm remembering your argument well, you could actually adopt a position that I don't have enough information to determine one way or the other whether it's odd or even. And so therefore I would be agnostic, not because there's not enough information. And so likewise, when it comes to the concept of does God exist, you're of the position, right, that I don't have enough information one way or the other uh, to know if God exists or not. Is that am I
Yeah,
character?
pretty much. I mean, there's something called zero data agnostic or a temporal agnostic, which would be that case, right? Where you just don't have enough information either way. But the problem when you say, like, I don't know, when we express things like I don't know, we're usually just doing it as a matter of what's called ordinary doubt, not a matter of what we consider to be knowledge, epistemically speaking, right? To have knowledge meets certain criteria based upon what people would call justified true belief. But when we're saying I don't know, it's not that I'm saying I have knowledge of God or I don't have knowledge of God. What it's saying is I don't have the ability right now to make a determination about my belief being that God exists or God does not exist. So I'm in the middle. There's a middle ground to be had there. Anybody who says otherwise probably go look into, reading some Graham Oppie or something. But there completely is a middle ground to be had there. And I think a lot of people, though, what they want to do is they want to like get people in their camp, right? And so me being a non-believer, me being somebody who's agnostic, all agnostics are non-believers because they obviously, if they believed in God, they would be believers. And they want to lump them in there, right? They want to say, look, you're one of us. You're one of the non-believer atheist people. But that what that does is it says, look, we're going to describe your label for you rather than allow you to tell people what your positions actually are. And I think there's a height of intellectual dishonesty to do that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, I can't resist asking you this question. So if you're an agnostic, then what do you think of Pascal's wager, right? Because it seems to me like if you truly are at a position where you don't know uh, or don't have enough the wherewithal, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this. If you don't have the wherewithal to make a determination if God exists or not, then why not just roll the dice that indeed God does exist? Because if he does exist, and you think and you bet against it, then the outcome is
Yeah,
horrific.
there's a risk reward there to be had, right? Eternal
Right.
reward versus eternal damnation. But when it comes to Pascal's wager, I mean, if you actually do the math, which I'm sure you have, I mean, depending on what deity you go by, the likelihood of you picking the right one, more specifically,
Right.
the idea of that right one, even the Christian God itself. And I'm not a theologian. I'll tell you right now, theology is not my jam. But there's a lot of different variations of the Christian God of Yahweh, and so even amongst Christians, if you don't get the right version, you might be a little bit out of luck as well. So I don't think Pascal's wager has ever been a good argument. I think back maybe way back when people were scared, right? There was like argumentum ad baculum, argument to the cudgel that say, look, if you don't agree with me, if you don't believe that I believe, then you're going to be, have suffer some kind of eternal damnation of some sorts. And I think that Pascal's wager in some way capitalizes on that. They say, hey, better safe than sorry, right? Because if you're wrong, look at the outcome. But at the same time, you're just using a fear tactic to say, look, you might as well believe case it's true, but there could be a lot of different ways where a God exists, and you got the wrong version. And he says, ah, man, you kind of messed up. You were so close, though.
Now I do have to bring up the point. I would argue as a Christian that actually the among the different Christian traditions that there actually is a remarkably unified view of God as being the triune God as being superpersonal, a superpersonal transcendent being. So, but I think to your larger point, if you're just operating from a framework of theism, is it Allah? Is it the Trinity of Christianity, or is it uh, the God Yahweh of Judaism?
Yeah, and what is the limiting factor? If God exists, right? He's obviously some kind of omnipotent, omnipotent kind of being of some sort. If at least I think that would be the case. That's more likely the case. If there's a God, that's the attributes that he's going to have. And those are kind of standard, and some type of properties that they're assigned to a deity. And so, where's the line of demarcation where he says, "Hey, you were so close. You believed almost everything correctly, but you got these few facts wrong. So you're not allowed in." I to me, it's just a binary option, right? Either you're going to heaven or you're not going to heaven. Again, logic. And if you're going to heaven, what was the criteria by which that God determined you met, and which that you didn't meet if you aren't allowed to get into heaven? And there seems to be some fuzzy logic in there. There seems to be a huge amount of space between what would be the case to allow entrance and what not, even if you just say, hey, well, anybody who subscribes to John 3:16 and that believes Christ is the risen Lord and things of that nature, you're saved. But even among epistemology, you would have to say that beliefs are gradient in some degrees, right? Our conviction of our belief. Either you believe or you don't believe, but our conviction for our belief, there's a lot of gradient there to be had.
Yeah. Yeah. You're I think the frustration that you feel about having your position maybe not being subsumed by other positions that want you kind of in your camp. I oftentimes feel that frustration as well, because I consider myself to be a creationist. But so oftentimes when people hear that term, they immediately think of young earth creationism, right? And they don't
I'm
appreciate.
guilty of that, by the way. I'll tell you right now, I am guilty of that. I hear creationists, and I know that you're creationist. And I know what type of creationist you are, but when I hear creationism, I'm so used to being around younger creationists that's what I mentally go to that place, right? And I
Yeah.
don't ever want to lump you in with the same group of younger creationists because they are science deniers, which I know for a fact you are not.
Yeah, well, but even then, when you say, okay, well, I'm an old Earth creationist, there's again a range of perspectives that fall under that umbrella. A lot of it has to do with how one understands the creation accounts in Genesis 1, and how do those creation accounts relate to the scientific record? And then what's interesting to me is you also have people that are theistic evolutionists, which you could, and what I find fascinating is that the organization BioLogos, founded by Francis Collins, today headed up by Dev Arzma, an organization that at reasons to believe we actually are friendly with, though we have quite substantial disagreement with them on a number of issues. They actually prefer the term evolutionary creationist as opposed to theistic evolutionist, because they want to place the emphasis on creation, that God on the creationist aspect, not on the evolution aspect. And so, so within the creationist umbrella, you have old Earth and evolutionary creationists that really have very differing views from one another, and of course, very differing views from young Earth creationists, and also, have again, very differing perspectives on how they see Christianity relating to the scientific record, to the data that's coming from science, or at least the ideas that are coming from science. And then even, of course, within the theistic evolution umbrella, there's a wide range of perspectives. In fact, one of the points we made when we've been engaging BioLogos is, you guys have such a broad range of perspectives, we have no idea actually how to even engage it. Because every time we engage an idea, 3/4 of the people in your organization will say, well, we don't hold to that idea, right? So it's almost maddening, but I think that goes to the point that we're trying to make, and that is, it really is worth the effort of asking people, a series of questions to really understand their perspective, and then engage, people on their own terms. I think that's the most intellectually honest way to do things, and not to try to force people into a convenient box, so that because that if they're in that box, there are these pet arguments that you can bring forward that's just going to knock down their case, but rather actually try to engage them on their own terms.
Well, that's why you ask them what their positions are. This is why I don't like making assumptions about certain people's positions, right? But this is why when you hear somebody say, look, I'm not a Christian, you shouldn't assume that they're necessarily an atheist, right? People make those assumptions. When I hear creationist, and I'm guilty of this, I'll fully admit that when I hear creationist, I do tend to younger creationist. But as you pointed out, even among the theistic evolutionist or the evolutionary creationist, there's a huge difference between certain beliefs. So I've talked to theistic creationists who think that, God's put everything out there and this kind of let it go in motion, knowing where it's going to end up, but really didn't have much of a hand along the way. There's other creationists, and I think that you might actually kind of fall into this particular one, that God makes little changes, infinite number of little changes along the way to get where he wants to go. I think that's more your position, if I remember correctly.
Well, and I take the view that God is intervening throughout Earth's history to bring about his creative purposes. And so I would say, in a broad sense, I'm skeptical of facets of the evolutionary framework, but I don't completely reject the reality of evolution. It's just that I'm not convinced that the mechanisms that we have available to us today can actually explain what I would call a biological innovation or the creation of biological novelty. So these are places where I believe you have to have a divine input. But precisely what do I mean by divine input? I'm still wrestling with that, quite honestly. So so somebody asked me, well, how is God intervening in nature? My response is, I don't know. And so there's actually some versions of theistic evolution where they do see God intimately involved in every moment of the process. Well, that's an intervention where God is and so that would be a view that would butt up against mine, where they just are seeing God creating through a process, but a process where he's, entirely in control. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have theistic evolutionists that would say, well, God, it's a clockwork universe. God's just winding it up and letting it rip, and whatever's going to come is going to come.
Yeah, well, when you say that God is like intervening on all these little micro steps, is he intervening that in some way that's in a materialistic fashion, or is it some kind of a supernatural fashion, which means that laws of physics are suspended? Like, for example, I did a presentation a long time ago on my channel on polonium halos, which is Gentry's work, and I kind of explained to people why polonium halos I don't think is a good argument for a young Earth. And one of the things that he had used as an explanation for the reasons why I think it's a bad argument is he brought into what's called singularities, is what he called it. And singularities, what he referred to as one-off instantiations of God's power to make things happen. And the way that I've heard things from like the reasons to believe paradigm would be more along the lines of there's all these different singularity events, but there's an infinite number of them. However, it's not necessarily from a like supernatural way. It's a matter of little naturalistic changes. Is that right?
Yeah, well, and not to belabor this point. So, if I'm going, in a direction you don't want to go, we'll reverse. But when you look at, as an example, the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 creation accounts, it's interesting because there are different Hebrew verbs that are used to describe God's work as creator. So one of them is bara. This is in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created, and there the word bara is used, which typically means God is involved in a direct personal way, but it is God originating something that has never existed before. And then there's another set of creation verbs, asa, yatsar, bana, that all are used to describe a potter making a piece of clay where it's existing material that God is then intimately involved in a personal way to bring about his creative purposes. And then there's words like haya, which means kind of to come to pass, where you could see this as being a process that's involved. And then there's dasha, which means just simply a process of nature. And all of these are just used to describe how God brings about his creative purposes. So the fun for somebody that holds my position is to ask the question, is God creating, within the laws of nature, outside the laws of nature? There was a couple of scholars that volunteer with us, Hugh Henry, who's a physicist, and Dan Dyke, who's an Old Testament scholar, and they coined a concept or a term to describe a concept they refer to as hypernaturalism. And here they argue that the primary mode by which God creates is through the laws of nature, but you know that God is involved because you have this just right sequence of events happening in the just right way, in the just right time, in order to bring about the result. And so they would argue that's as much as of a quote unquote miracle as God just saying, speaking, and poof, something comes into existence. So even within the idea of God intervening, to kind of the larger point here, is that there's really a range of ways one could see God intervening. And so we feel like our task is, let's study what's going on in nature. Let's collect the information that we can from science and see, is this something that really can be explained as secondary causation, where God is, has set up providentially processes that produce a particular result? Or is God intervening within the laws of nature? Or is it something that looks like it's completely outside the laws of nature. So, even within that framework of how's God intervening, there's a wide range of options, which to me makes, again, the work that I do a whole lot of fun, because I don't have to go into it with the necessity of there being a predetermined outcome, right? That's dictated by my religious beliefs, but there's actually the opportunity to explore what nature is telling us, and go where the evidence leads us.
Yeah, and I definitely think that I know in a future episode, because I brought up to you earlier before, that one of the things I do want to explore with you, because I believe it or not, I've read some of your stuff. Shocker, right? But when it comes to like the human chromosome number 2 that you've written about, where you do actually hold that it was some kind of I guess manifestation of God's interaction in order to make happen, in order to have the
Right.
diploid number change for your humans. But I do want to back it up a little bit if we can, because I know we're getting into the more sciencey stuff. But you had something earlier that I thought was kind of interesting. You said about you don't believe something, right? And I don't remember specifically what it was, but you say that you're not convinced of something. And I
Oh,
wanted
okay.
to
Yeah. Right.
yeah, and I wanted to touch on that a little bit, because I think it's important as the first episode about not being convinced of something and the burden of proof that exists in that particular position. Because a lot of people, for some reason, I don't know why, think that merely by saying that I don't have a belief, that there's no burden of proof to be had there. And it makes no sense to me, epistemologically speaking. And let me kind of explain why. A lot of things I see happen in the atheist community, and again, I'm not trying to drag the atheist community by any stretch of imagination, but I see this a lot in my interactions, is what they do is called what's called a Mote and Bailey fallacy. And what a Mote and Bailey fallacy is, basically they'll assert some kind of very strong position, like gods are impossible. And then when you challenge them on it and you say, well, what makes it impossible? Because you're dealing with literally possible world theory, and you have to show there's some kind of logical contradiction, that God cannot exist in any possible world, which I think is in itself an impossible task. I am convinced that there's just no possible way that you can say gods are impossible completely, and I think that gods must exist in some possible world. But that doesn't make me a theist, obviously. That's possible world theory. But if I'm not convinced of that, there's still an onus to be had. Just like if I said to you, hey, Fuzz, you've written some papers before. Like you wrote some paper on was it lipoprotein or lipo? What was it? Salmonella.
Oh yeah, lipopolysaccharides.
Lipopolysaccharides, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so you wrote a paper on lipopolysaccharides, and I said, hey, you know what? I've read your paper, Fuzz. I don't believe you, and I'm going to rewrite. I'm going to write a paper to show that you're wrong, and I'm going to do is just basically say I don't believe you.
Right.
Right. That doesn't tell anybody why I think that your paper is not something that should be accepted. And I
Right.
think climate change is a very good thing to use an example as well. If I said to you, look, Fuzz, I don't believe in climate change, you're probably going to look at me like I'm a science denier, right? I mean, I have to give you a reason to be justified, to have a rational position, whether it's position of affirming or position of not accepting, why I don't accept climate change. And I think the same thing happens when it comes to theological positions. If you assert something like God exists, you assert that, God has intervened, and I merely just sit back and say, look, Fuzz, I don't believe you. Am I adding anything to the conversation? And am I rational just to say that without giving you an explanation of why I don't accept your claims? I think that not. I think that justifications are required, whether you accept or not accept, whether you affirm or deny or reject. Uh, and so when you're talking about not believing something, I hope that when we have these discussions, we're talking about specific instances of arguments, why you don't think the argument is good, right? And I'll do the same to you. If you think if I give you an argument, you go, that's not a good argument, and I say, well, why is it not a good argument? You go, I don't believe you. It's not going to have very good. It doesn't really give anybody any explanation of why you hold your particular position or non-position, right?
Yeah. So let me ask you, just for the sake of having some fun here, let me ask you this. So what do you say to somebody who says that really atheism and theism are essentially positions that are predicated ultimately on faith? That atheism is much a religious position or a faith-based position as theism or Christian theism. I hear people that are Christians make this kind of assertion all the time. How would you engage that point.
I actually have some videos on this on my channel, and I actually hold the position that atheism is not a religious position. I hold the position that atheism is held to have the same protections as a religion, right? But that's not the same thing. If somebody says, "Look, I'm at my work, I don't believe in God," a person, people that their bosses shouldn't be able to have any kind of bias toward them because they don't have a religious belief. So they have afforded the same protections. But atheism itself is not a religion. However, there's a caveat there. Even though I don't hold that atheism is religion, the religiosity of some atheists is very similar to what I see for evangelicals. There are people that are, again, and I see this quite frequently, that are willing to actually forget about logic, to say logic is, what's wrong, when it doesn't fit their belief system and doesn't fit their narrative. It doesn't fit their agenda. It doesn't fit their dogma or their ideological considerations. And I think that's unfortunate, because if you're going to hold yourself in a position to be the rational party in a discussion and you say, look, yeah, hey, Fuzz, your logic looks good on paper, but in the real world, it's not correct. That I take umbrage of, because what they're doing is saying, I am throwing away logic and reason in order to sustain my position. And I've seen atheists criticize Christians for that, well deservedly so, some of them. And Christians do, say the same thing about atheists. Again, well deservedly so. I've seen just as many atheists willing to throw away logic when they have an argument that they're confronted with that goes, against what they've been I don't want to say trained to say, but indoctrinated in some ways, just like there have been Christians that have been indoctrinated to believe certain things, right? So, no, I don't hold that as religion by any means, but religiosity and dogmatism exist in any community. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a Christian community or atheist community. That position to say, look, I am willing to suspend logic in order to say that I'm right, you lose all sense of rationality at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's something else that I think would be fun exploring with you, Steve. Um, uh, and I don't mean this in a combative way, but would you say that there is a fundamental distinction between theism and atheism, in this sense, that for somebody who's a theist who is saying, I believe that God exists and here are the reasons why I believe, they're making a positive case for theism. But since in an atheistic perspective, where you're saying I have no belief in God, how do you prove a negative, right? Just because there's an absence of evidence doesn't mean that's evidence for absence. So it seems to me that really atheism and Christian theism may actually be really very different perspectives, in that you could make in principle a positive case for Christian theism, but you can never make a positive case for atheism.
I think it's a common misconception when people hear the word burden of proof. They think it means to prove something, and it doesn't. There's different types of burdens going on in any conversation. It's not burden tennis. It's not I say something, I have a burden, you say something, you have a burden. There's multiple burdens going on at one time. Matter of fact, there's a burden of persuasion, burden of production. There's the burden to say, look, I don't agree with you. Let me tell you why. But when somebody said, look, can you prove a negative? Yeah, actually you can. It's called proof by impossibility, right? So if you have a proof by impossibility, sure, you can prove a negative, but I have no onus to do so. If you say God exists, I don't have an onus to disprove that, right? What I do have an onus, if I'm having a conversation and I want to convince you that you're incorrect, then I have a burden of persuasion, which is a type of burden of proof, but it's not to prove to you that you're wrong. It's really more to say, look, these are the reasons why I think that you're incorrect, right? It's kind of more undermining your justificatory conditions. There's a I was trying to think what I should call it. There's a method out there called street epistemology. I don't know if you've heard of it before. But street epistemology, they actually go around and they talk to people. And one of the things they try to do is undermines people's justificatory conditions. And I think that's a good way to attack arguments, right? But you don't have to show, if I say, look, there is no God, I don't have to prove that to anybody, right? I have a burden on myself to justify why I believe it, right? That's an onus that I have to myself. It's more of a self-assessment type of thing that say, look, if I'm holding the position that God does not exist, I need to myself justify it. But if I'm just giving you a autobiographical statement or self-assessment of my belief, I don't have any onus to explain to you why I hold that particular position. But if I'm trying to convince you when we're having these discussions, an argument, then I now have a burden to say, hey, look, God doesn't exist. Let me show you why. And the same thing applies to any Christian, right? And I get a lot of flack for this because people say, well, you're letting theists off the hook when they say, hey, look, God exists. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not letting them off the hook. If they say God exists and they want to convince you that God exists, they have a burden. But if they just say, hey, look, I hold the position God exists, but I'm not going to really go into my reasons why he does. I've accepted it for my own personal justification. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. As long as they make their own burden to themselves, they can be irrational and justified for holding that position, which I think I diverge from greatly in the skeptic community on that particular regard, because a lot of skeptics hold the position that theists cannot be justified in any regard. And I think that's absolutely incorrect, honestly.
Yeah. So then if somebody says, if I'm a Christian, I'm engaging an atheist, and I say, and the atheist says, well, I don't believe that God exists. I would agree with you. I'm perfectly fine. Hey, you've got your justification. But then if I ask, so then what is the basis for, for you rejecting belief in God? And they say, well, I just have never seen any evidence that convinces me that God exists. Is that a legitimate?
It's vacuous. No, I have an argument about about very thing, right? When somebody's it's almost like it's redundant to say I don't believe because I don't believe, right? That's clearly redundant. If I say I don't believe because I'm not convinced, it's not telling me anything. It's not giving anybody why I don't believe, because I can figure out deductively. If you don't believe, I can show using logic that you don't believe because you haven't had enough information to convince you. Because had you had enough information to convince you, you would believe. So it's almost like a tautology of some sorts to say, I don't believe, therefore I'm not convinced, or I'm not convinced, therefore I don't believe. It doesn't tell anybody anything. It's not, to me, a justificatory condition to say why I hold a particular position. But if I say, look, I don't think there's a God, and here's the reasons, because over the last thousands of years of humanity, we've always found naturalistic explanations. And whenever we posited a non-natural explanation, like thunder and lightning being, well, lightning, I guess, from Thor, we found that there's actually a scientific explanation for it. And so probabilistically, any God, in this case, a naturalistic type God or something that controls nature, that God probably doesn't exist. And so I don't hold the position that there are no gods, because we tend to find a natural explanation along the lines. That's a much greater degree of justification than merely just saying, I'm not convinced. You haven't convinced me. That's not an argument. Saying you're not convinced is not an argument.
Right.
I think about time. Did you want to start taking some Q&As? We can take them a little bit early.
Yeah, let's do that.
I know we had planned a little bit more, but I didn't expect it to be such a overwhelming response. This is actually pretty amazing. It's a lot of people in there that I know from my own channel, so I wanted to thank them for showing up tonight. This is awesome.
So I think you are in control of the Q&A.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, let's do this. This is how I normally do it on my channels. If somebody wants to ask a question, put at Fuzz or at me, and that way it shows up in yellow for one of us, or at least I can see it a little bit clearer to who it's directed to, and then we can answer questions from there. Because I like when it directed to one person, or if you want, we can have kind of I answer from my worldview, which, by the way, we never really got into discussing why we started doing this in the first place, why we wanted to show people how different worldviews have different ways of looking at things, especially from a scientific perspective, right? The way you approach things as a scientist, you may not be specifically biased by your religion, but as a theist, I think that you probably look things a little bit differently than how I would as a non-believer, correct?
Yeah, I think that's true. And to maybe the larger point first, and that is, part of doing this program is to expose people to how two people from differing worldviews can actually see how they see something, and where the points of agreement are, and the points of difference. Yeah, I am a firm believer as a scientist in the power of the scientific method. The scientific method should be the great equalizer, right? Where regardless of what your preference or your bias is, that the data and the implications of the data or what exists. And so, you eventually, I believe that science does have the wherewithal to discover or at least begin to converge on what is objectively true about the world of nature, recognizing again that scientific ideas are all and theories and hypotheses are always provisional, and new discoveries can radically change the way we think about the world and understand the world. So, but having said that, I do believe that science is indeed the great equalizer. But I do, wear the lens of a Christian theist, and I'm not strictly. I don't strictly adhere to methodological naturalism. I would adopt what I would call a soft form of methodological naturalism, where I believe that the best place to begin a scientific investigation is to look for mechanistic explanations. But I also believe that if the data seems to point in the direction where there looks like there may have been a mind involved, that I'm willing to go down that path and try to design ways to further test or explore that idea scientifically. So, my theism does influence how I do science. The approach that I take, there are many Christians who would be completely uncomfortable with my perspective on soft methodological naturalism, who would be even though they're Christian theists, they would be very hard and very firm in terms of methodological naturalism. So I do think my lens as a Christian does influence how I see things, maybe more so influences where I'm willing to go in terms of providing an explanation for the phenomena that we see in nature. But having said that, there are a number of instances where I have recognized that an idea that I had that was shaped by my theistic commitments actually turned out to be wrong, and we revised the way that we look at things as a result of that. As a case in point, in 2005, I along with Hugh Ross, published a book called Who Was Adam?, where we were looking at the data from anthropology and asking the question, can we make sense of the biblical account of human origins in light of the data from anthropology? And part of what we explored in that project was, did humans and Neanderthals interbreed? And at the time that the book was published, there was no evidence for interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals whatsoever.
There is now.
There is now. And when we wrote the updated edition, there was, in my estimation, very good, compelling reasons to think that humans and Neanderthals interbred. And so we actually revised our model in light of that, for us, what was an inconvenient reality, because our preference and our predictions were that humans and Neanderthals wouldn't interbreed. And so we were forced to go back and then ask the hard questions. Can we revise our model in light of this? And if we do, how so? How so would we do it? But when we published the updated edition, we left the original edition intact, with the idea that anybody could come to that book then and see what we thought when we originally published it, and what were our ideas, what were our predictions. And then we had a 10-year update where we said, okay, this is what's been discovered in the intervening years, and this is what it means. And these are places where we were wrong. These are places where we were right, and we revised accordingly. So even though I've got a commitment to theism, and it does shape the way that I look at certain phenomena in nature, or shapes the possible explanations I might bring to the table, I also recognize that there is power in the scientific method, and ultimately it is what it is.
No, I totally agree with you. I'm a firm believer in the scientific method and scientific methodology myself, because I think that if we're going to try to find out what is true, science is one of the best ways to do it. If we're exploring the natural universe, right? Science is a tool that we use to observe a natural phenomenon and explain it using naturalistic explanations, right? That the supernatural is basically excluded from science for a reason. It's called methodological naturalism. The reason being is because you could actually literally posit an infinite number of supernatural causations, right? but that's not what we're looking for in science, right? It doesn't mean that supernatural causation doesn't exist. Again, I don't have much position on it, but science itself is not looking for supernatural causation, right? It cannot actually conclude a supernatural causation. And I think that science in of itself is set up, at least nowadays in modern science, that it always wants to use the best available data known, right? So like you were talking about before, we didn't know much about the intermixing of humans and Neanderthals. And so there was no data to be had. But as science progressed, we learned much more about that particular topic, right? So I think science is the quintessential tool to be used on that particular topic of observing the universe and coming up with a natural explanation. And I think it's misused quite frequently when people say, look, science disproves God. And as soon as I hear something like that, I kind of just go, well, I don't think you really understand science, right? Because science is not the tool to me to disprove God. But at the same token, this is where you and I might disagree a little bit. I don't think science is a tool to prove God either, right? Now, science can help you justify a belief for whatever reason. I have no problem with that whatsoever. You think science leads you to the belief that God exists because that's how you're observing things and that's what you're concluding, that's fine. But science itself will never be able to be the tool to be used to say, look, we quintessentially know that God exists or quintessentially know that God does not exist, especially for the fact that if God exists, he literally could change the rules of the game at any time he wants, making this entire scientific method invalid, right? You can say that induction doesn't work tomorrow. Right. I have to assume induction works tomorrow, right? There's no way to justify the use of induction. It's just something that just cannot be justified. It's not warrantable. It's not justifiable. We just assume presuppositionally that it will continue to work. We have no other choice. But God could actually change that, right? He could actually change the uniformity of nature. And so if there's a God, the entire scientific approach doesn't work if that's what he wants. So we kind of have to exclude that from science. Would you agree that at least from a scientific perspective, you can't really incorporate God into it?
Yeah, and our we're getting a signal from our producer that we need to move on. You know what? This would actually be a really fun discussion to devote a whole show to. Is what is the nature of science? What is the extent of methodological naturalism? How do I justify my soft methodological naturalism? So maybe we'll put a pin in it because I've got a lot to say about the point you're making.
No, I think that'd be great because again, I think that like science, tries to explain what we think are facts and the truth, and philosophy kind of goes into what is a fact, what is the truth. But I know we got some questions in the audience. There's one here
and I'm supposed to do something too. I'm supposed to remind people about the giveaway again, and then I guess give a little bit more information. Well, you guys have put the two wrong people in charge of trying to.
Well, I can't even promote my own channel half the time. You think we're going to remember how to do promotional giveaways? Even though this is a cool cup, I got to admit, I love this color. This little ruddy burnt orange really went well with the black.
Yeah, so I'm just going to read the script here because that's about all I'm capable of doing. I can just see everybody just face palming. That's behind the scenes. Okay. All right. We're giving away Agreed to Argue swag. You can win stickers, notebooks, and mugs just by entering the giveaway at agreetoargue.com/contest. The giveaway starts today and will end on August 11th at 12 p.m. Pacific time, just before episode 2 goes live. Just follow the instructions on the agreetoargue.com site to enter, and there are multiple ways to earn entries and new ways to earn even more entries that will become available in a couple of days, and we'll be announcing the winners by email on our next episode. And I think we're giving away 25 Agree to Argue swag thingies. So there we go.
I got mine. I got coffee.
That's right. Yeah. But these actually are really cool colors.
They are. I got to admit, I think the colors worked out exceptionally well.
Well, and as a Cincinnati Bengals fan, these are the right colors. And knowing that I'm a Cincinnati Bengals fan should tell you everything you need to know, because I have lived through the problem of evil as a Cincinnati Bengals fan.
Which, by the way, would be a great topic one of these days: evidential and logical problem of evil.
Yeah.
So there are a couple questions. One of them, if you message at Agree to Argue, if you got questions. But the one that's directed to me that I really would like to answer, even though I'm only going to give a really tertiary kind of answer because we could probably spend 2 hours on this particular topic, and this deals with moral theory. So Rebecca Kinen, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. If not, I'm sorry for butchering it. But Rebecca Kinen Finn says, as a Christian, my moral code comes from the Bible. As a non-theist, where do you base your moral code? What influences? And I think that's a wonderful question. I hold the particular position that morality exists independent whether God exists or not. I tend to objective morality, right? I think most philosophers do. And by the way, I'm not a philosopher. I just read about philosophy. But most philosophers that I've read do tend to objective morality. But my moral code really is contingent upon different types of moral frameworks. And one of the which I tend to the most was called virtue ethics. And virtue ethics is about what is ethical as the character of yourself. What is virtuous? And it's based upon the principle of if you have a thing you strive for, a principle that you strive for that's between two vices. For example, let's say like you want to be brave, right? Brave is a virtue. You don't want to be coward, which is a vice, and you don't want to be reckless, which is a vice. You want to be in that happy medium. It's called the Archimedean medium, or the Aristotelian mean. And so you want to be in the middle ground there. And so I tend to, for my moral, what's called normative ethics, I tend to virtue epistemology. But for like meta ethics, I tend to what's called moral realism. But where I get that from is formulating a position after reading about these topics, right? And I think that a lot of people get their moral code from the beginning from friends and family and parents. I think that we're instantiated with that to some degree and influenced by our environment. And there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I don't hold the position that you need a deity to have a moral framework. And that's probably where I would differ with a lot of theists. Some theists say, look, without God, you can't be moral. I don't hold that position at all. However, if God exists, he might be able to dictate the moral code through some kind of divine command theory, which I hold as what's called ethical subjectivism. But it's not a necessity. So when you ask me where I get my moral code from, it is from moral theories like virtue epistemology. Do you want to touch on that? I mean, about your moral framework, Fuzz?
Yeah, and I think we actually are planning on doing a full episode.
Yeah, that's a long episode.
Yeah. But I mean, just briefly, I do believe that that the moral framework is actually something that is dictated from God, and it's a manifestation or a reflection of his character. But this idea of it being kind of a command, command ethics or whatever, I think sometimes makes it feel a bit arbitrary, like God is arbitrarily setting in place these particular standards. But to me, there's actually an impeccable logic that undergirds the ethical system that flows out of Christianity, and it's predicated on the idea that human beings are made in God's image. And so the idea is that if humans are made in God's image, then every human being has infinite worth and value. And then out of that, that's the kind of the logical organizing principle or framework that I think produces Christian ethics. So it's, and so, I think the idea of the golden rule, treating people as you would want to be treated yourself, I think deeply connects to this idea that each human life has infinite worth and value. And so anyway, that's just very briefly.
And we're definitely gonna have to put a pin in that because there's so much that you just said that I want to talk about one of these days, but that's a whole new episode, I think. So let's see. I'm having a little bit difficult time trying to read some of these questions, so please bear with me. Hopefully we'll have somebody put them in the live chat here. What we could do is this. I see some questions that are directed to Fuzz, and then I'll just read them and you can answer. Sound good?
Sure.
All right. So this one's directed to you. What books would you recommend to a beginner about Christian philosophy?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. The first book that I read from a Christian philosopher, kind of laying out the philosophical, strength of the Christian faith, was a book by the late Ron Nash, who was a philosopher of religion. And the book is called Faith and Reason. So if you can get a hold of that book as a uh, uh, that would be a great place to start. That's where I cut my teeth. Also, anything by J.P. Moreland or William Lane Craig would be excellent resources. Off the top of my head, I don't have titles, but those would be two names that I would recommend you explore.
Can I recommend a couple? Even though the
Sure.
question. Okay. Okay. I will recommend. There'll be one Christian book and one non-Christian book. I'm not trying to shill for RTB. I'm honestly, I'm not. But I did read Improbable Planet, right, by Dr. Ross, and I actually thought it was pretty good. I'm not going to front. I think that he put a lot of science into it. I'm not an astrophysicist, but I like the way that he put the science out there. And then he has his conclusion on it, but he makes an argument. He makes an actual argument, good, bad, or indifferent. And I think that from a Christian perspective, it probably does make sense. So I would recommend A Probable Planet. But another book that I recommend, and this one deals with, like, people had asked me, if you want to get into philosophy, what's some of the really better books to read? And I always give them this one, and they seem kind of surprised until they read it. And this is a book called Flatland by Edwin Abbott.
Mm.
It was written back in the 1800s. And it deals a lot with, like, space-time. It deals with dimensions. It deals with social norms. But it really opens up your mind to thinking in a higher dimension. And that's what actually it's called, because literally the subtitle is a romance in many dimensions, if I'm not mistaken. But if you really want to read a good book, read Flatland by Edwin Abbott. It's amazing. Another one for Fuzz. Well, actually, I think to me, please ask Steve to provide his burden of justification why he rejects atheism. I've actually done that numerous times. That's a long, involved question about why I don't believe, uh, why I don't affirm atheism, why I don't hold the position that there are no gods. Mostly, I mean, to put it in a nutshell, I think that an explanation for the causality of the universe could be a deity or some kind of intelligence, what we perceive to be an intelligence or an organized mind of some sort. What you want to call that, I don't know. Christians will call it Yahweh. Um, maybe a more pagan would call them chaos or something along those lines. But the possibility of an explanation for the universe eludes us at the moment. And who knows what it is? I mean, everything that you possibly could try to use to explain the universe seems to me to fail. I don't accept any explanation for the universe because I have no way to even begin to evaluate why the universe exists as opposed to not existing. And so I don't hold the position that maybe some mind didn't, or maybe some mind did create the universe, or that's completely possible. So I think to kind of put it out there real quick about my justification is that the explanation for the universe makes just as much sense to say that the mind did it, or some people use what's called simulation theory, as opposed to any other. I mean, I don't have any way to evaluate it one way or another. I just take an agnostic position on it that sure it's possible, but I'm not going to say with any kind of I don't want to use the word certainty or surety, but basically I don't want to put the belief out there that I say, look, I believe there is no possibility that God did it, or there's no being out there that somehow created the universe, because the universe probably has some kind of reason why we're here, but what it is, who knows, right? Did you want to touch on that, Fuzz? I mean, I mean, would you agree that somebody who says, look, it is not possible for God to have created the universe has a huge burden of why that makes sense to them?
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who's a Christian theist, I think the answer is yes, because to me, when you look at the fact that at least the local universe that we're part of does appear to have a beginning, at least the data from astronomy really seems to indicate that matter, energy, space, and time uh, that comprise this universe had a singularity beginning. That is easily and readily understood as being, again, the work of a transcendent personal creator. And also couple that to the fact that you do see the fine tuning of the constants of physics. So that is completely consistent with the notion that the universe is the product of a mind, a personality, but also people that hold to a non-theistic perspective would say, but there's also the possibility of the multiverse, right? That or some kind of eternally existing, quantum field where the fluctuations, end up producing this, this quantum foam that leads to the multiverse. So, I mean, those are, alternative explanations. So, really, how do you evaluate, which one of these two is the best way to go? And in fact, I heard a talk from a number of years ago at a Skeptic Society conference by, oh goodness, his name is connected with string theory. This is happening more
Leonard
and more.
Susskind?
Huh?
Leonard Susskind?
That's it, Leonard Susskind, where he essentially made the point that the multiverse is functionally equivalent to God, right? And so, and Susskind, I don't think is any friend necessarily to theism. I don't know, but I suspect he's no friend to theism. But the point here is that by making that statement, there's this recognition that there's, I think, legitimacy to holding an agnostic perspective, right? And I think it really goes down to, subjectively, what does a person find compelling. What I do find interesting, though, is that regardless of your worldview perspective, you have to posit some kind of uncaused cause that brought the universe into existence, whether it's a god, or whether it's this eternal.
Aquinas would agree with you. I don't necessarily agree with that, but
what's that?
Aquinas would agree with you.
Yeah,
Thomas Aquinas would agree with you.
But even somebody that is a non-theist would, who would prefer some kind of mechanistic explanation, has to posit eventually an eternally existing, gravitational field or something like that.
Yeah, again, well, that's my point exactly, right? I mean, to me, it's just these are just nomenclatures, right? I mean, if you posit some kind of eternally existing field, as you said, a quantum foam of some foam, let's say, what's a Higgs field, right? Let's say the Higgs field, which is ubiquitous, right? Let's say that is something that exists. It cannot fail to exist for whatever reason. That's very similar to what theists would say for a God. God cannot fail to exist. It's a metaphysical necessity that must exist in all possible worlds. So these are just placeholders. So I don't have enough information to determine what actually is the causation of the universe, if there necessarily is a cause. I'm not convinced there necessarily has to be a beginning. I do think that there probably was of some kind, but there's many different types of beginnings, right? I mean, many different types of causations, even in Aristotelian causes. But I think that we're all trying to seek answers. And so to me, saying that God created something, or there's some kind of, universal field that existed throughout non-existence, to me, they're just as mind-boggling, right? It's just very difficult to comprehend. Somebody had asked, will you guys ever invite guests or bring guests on to the show? Or is this strictly two hosts discussing topics? I have no problem with guests, and I think Fuzz probably wouldn't either somewhere down the line. I know we were going to do this in studio, but unfortunately, because of the world conditions right now, we've had to do this socially distancing, which seemed to work out fine. But I'm more than happy to have specific guests come on when we have specific topics of Fuzzes.
Yeah. I would love to have guests on the show. Yeah. And if people have recommendations for guests or for show topics, we'd love to hear them.
Somebody had asked, will this channel be mostly dedicated to theological topics, or will be exploring secular topics also? And that was from Leo Phyllis. Leo Phyllis. Here's the thing. I'm not really a theologian by any stretch of imagination, right? I don't know much about the Bible, to be honest with you. So I don't think a lot of our discussions are going to be theologically based. I think a lot of them will alternate between science and philosophy and the integration of the two, because I think science and philosophy are intricately related. Matter of fact, science came from philosophy, the study of nature. And so without philosophy, science is absolutely useless. I mean, we use philosophy all the time in science to guide it. Even methodological naturalism is a philosophical position. So I don't think a lot of this is going to be dealing with theological considerations at all. I think it's mostly going to be dealing with what arguments do we have based upon science and philosophy that lead us to our individual conclusions or individual positions, which, Fuzz and I have some diametrically opposite positions. But on some of the bigger stuff, I mean, we actually, like I said, we agree on a lot of things, which is why we call it agree to argue, because we don't have to disagree to even have an argument. We just both present our positions and see where we can have a meeting of the minds.
Yeah. But, I would be open to exploring other topics, beyond philosophy and science. It would depend upon the topic, I think, but yeah, again, if people have suggestions, we would love to hear them. And there's ways you can, offer your suggestions by going to the Agree to Argue Twitter or Facebook pages and just post your suggestions for potential show topics or potential guests, and we'll definitely consider them.
There's another question I want to answer, but before I do, my co-host for Caffeine Corner, Chester Vic, says Fuzz is the cutest, and I love his jacket. What's so funny? Before we started here, I was going to wear mine, and I actually show Fuzz. I actually have, yes, Chester, I have a jacket, but it's 1,000 degrees in here, and I'd be sweltering. And I was like, I pointed out the same thing you did. He looked really good in his jacket, and I was going to wear mine, but I decided not to.
I've got a T-shirt on. And to me, a jacket can cover a multitude of sins. So you throw on a jacket and suddenly you mean all business.
Right? Yeah, exactly. You get like a higher authority when you're wearing a jacket, right? Oh, that person's wearing a jacket. They must be correct.
I need all the help I can get, man. I got to wear a jacket.
So somebody had asked a really good question. They basically said, well, Steve, logically, either you believe or you don't believe, right? Then that is true. It is either the case you believe the proposition is true, or you don't believe the proposition is true. I don't believe the proposition God exists is true. I'm an agnostic. All agnostics don't believe God exists. If they did, they would be a theist, right? But agnostics are non-theist. This is what I'm saying when it comes to propositions. What we're saying is, if I give you a claim, I am saying that the proposition is the case. That is true, right? If I say the sky is blue, I'm saying it is the case that the sky is blue. So the proposition the sky is blue has a truth value of true. And when I say that, let's say that is some kind of the gumballs and God analogy, for example, is a perfect example that I used on my 3M philosophy. I look at a jar of gumballs. I don't have a position either way, whether even or odd, right? If the proposition is the number of gumballs are even, I don't have a position on that. I don't hold that as true, and I don't hold that as false. I hold the middle position, which is I don't have a position either way on it. So when you don't have a position that the gumballs are even, you don't believe that they're even. So yes, it is basically P or not P would be the proposition is true or not true. But beliefs are not necessarily dichotomous like that. You believe or you don't believe. That is a dichotomy. But believe true and believe false is not a dichotomy. There is a room for middle ground. That's where the agnostic lies. Does that make a little more sense to the person who asked that question? So you're right. You either believe or you don't believe. I don't believe, else I would be a theist. But that doesn't mean that I hold the position that the gumballs are odd, or in this case, the God, some God does not, all gods don't exist. And by the way, I do want to appreciate that you actually took the time to read that blog, Fuzz. That actually was kind of proofread by a friend of mine, Landon Curtin, who's a mathematician. And it's got a lot of traction. I've had people actually just say, look, your logic is right. I can't find anything wrong with it, but you're still wrong by fiat, which just seems to kind of surprise me, because it's like, if you think that the blog is wrong, you think that my argumentation is wrong, give a reason, because there's nothing wrong with the logic. I've never found anybody that says the logic wrong, but it's that position to say, look, hey, Steve has to be wrong. We're missing something here, but they never can articulate why. So we got some more questions. For Fuzz, what do you say to people who say you fit science to match the Bible and vice versa? That's from R.A. Driver.
Yeah, that's a common objection that we receive at Reasons to Believe in general, and all I can do is maybe in response to this is tell a very quick story, because I didn't grow up in a Christian home, and the first time that I actually read the Bible seriously was when I was 23 years old as a graduate student, and the only other passages of scripture that I read prior to the time I was in graduate school was reading Genesis 1. And the only reason I read Genesis 1 was I went to college in West Virginia, which is in the heart of the Bible Belt. And this was in the early 80s, which was the time of the trials in Arkansas, where creation science was on trial. And the professors I had, who were my biology professors, were concerned that creation science would infiltrate the public educational system in West Virginia, and kind of formed an advocacy group for teaching science, and in more generally teaching, or more specifically teaching evolution in public schools, as well as having a robust evolutionary curriculum within the biology programs at the state universities. And as a result of that, everybody suddenly became interested in discussing Genesis 1. So I read Genesis 1 along with everybody else. And I had a friend who was a fellow chemistry major by the name of David Flynn. And David's father was a Methodist minister. And he and I would get into these really interesting discussions about, was Jesus's genome haploid or diploid and things like that because of the virgin birth. And anyway, so one day we were discussing Genesis 1. And I don't know what, prompted me to say this, but I said to David, why couldn't day in Genesis 1 be a period of time? Why does it have to be 24 hours? And I said, and look at this. If you actually look at day as being a period of time, there's this incredible agreement that you see between the Genesis 1 creation account and the scientific record, that there's this incredible concordance. And so even as a non-Christian, I saw that the Genesis 1 account seemed to be really unusual in terms of the way it correlated with the record of nature. And in fact, there's an interesting book written by a guy named Andrew Parker, who is a paleontologist. He's an expert in the Cambrian explosion, and wrote a book called In a Blink of an Eye, which is his model for why he thinks the Cambrian explosion event was triggered. And he argues that it was the advent of the eye that triggered the Cambrian explosion. But anyway, he points out that in response to his book, he was getting letters from people asking, well, could the Cambrian explosion be in reference to the fifth day of creation, where the waters are described as teeming with life? And so he was curious about that, and he began to look into Genesis 1 and wrote a book called The Genesis Enigma, where he actually reached the same conclusion I reached as an undergraduate student that had no religious affiliation or interest whatsoever. And that is, it looks as if Genesis 1 is this remarkable agreement between science, the events that are described and the scientific record. Now, he still identifies himself as a non-theist, but points out that there seems to be this remarkable agreement. So I guess the whole point to me is that I don't think I'm trying to fit science into scripture or scripture into science, but rather I think I would argue I discovered there seems to be this harmony or this correspondence.
Yeah, I know you self-describe it as creationist, and this is why I do differentiate the type of creationism that you have, as opposed to like the younger creationists, where I do see them try to fit their belief into the science, right? The science, if the science and their belief have disharmony, it must be the science that's wrong, not the belief. And I think that's a really ill way to try to approach coming to understand the universe, right? I mean, if you have something right in front of you, I have this mug right in front of me. I've got something there, right? And just to say, look, I have the belief of some presupposition that mugs don't exist, right? But I have one in front of me that's an instantiation of that. Something has to give. And I think the rational approach is what's going to give is, hey, my belief is probably wrong, because we formulate beliefs all the time, and a lot of our beliefs are incorrect. We change them all the time. Nothing wrong with that, right? To be so firm on something and to say, look, I cannot be wrong on my belief is not rational, unless it's something that you can literally not be wrong on. They're called incorrigible beliefs. There are some beliefs that you can't be wrong on because they're metaphysical necessities. Oh my goodness, we're just getting a lot of these questions in here. Let's see here. Steve, so Steve holds the rejection of atheism because there could be an intelligent entity. What rational justification does he have for this possibility? First of all, I don't reject atheism. Rejectionism under what's called Frege approach is to accept negation or believe the negation. So when I say that I reject the proposition, that means I believe the proposition is false, right? It's a little bit different than deny a proposition. Deny a proposition means to assert that the proposition is false, right? An assertion of something requires a little bit different burden of proof because you're trying to persuade somebody rather than just saying, I hold the belief. So when I say I reject a proposition, I am saying I believe that proposition is false, but I don't necessarily need to show you or tell you why. But I think you mean that why you don't accept atheism. I don't accept atheism, not just because there's a possibility. I don't accept bare possibilities. What I was trying to explain for the justification is that exactly what Fuzz was saying earlier. There probably is some kind of universal thing out there. I mean, we would call it a Higgs field. We can call them the quantum, what's called a 0 point energy, quantum fields. Something seems to persist regardless of the universe existence or not. Even if you look at what's called the no boundary proposal with Stephen Hawking, you can go back and you modeled time equal to zero using imaginary time. Something still existed. What it was, we have no concept of, right? Because at that point, time has no meaning, but there still was some kind of quantum permeation of sorts. And so, what you want to call that, the Christians are going to say, look, what's the distinction between that and a deity of some kind? I don't know. I think the possibility is fine. And to say that something's impossible means that you have to be able to show logically that there's an actual contradiction that cannot exist in any possible world. Like, for example, a square circle cannot exist in any possible world. That is a illogical object that does not exist. I can say that does not exist in any possible world. But if you say, hey, in some possible world, pigs can fly. Yeah, because it's not a logical contradiction. And in some possible world, pigs can fly. So that's my justification on that. Question from Nick. Talk about your backgrounds and your experiences influencing both your present belief system. Buzz?
Yeah, well, we're getting the 2-minute warning here.
Yeah, that's gonna be a real quick answer. We have to be like a 1-minute answer each.
Yeah, well, I mean, bottom line is, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. In fact, my father was a Muslim, and I dabbled in Islam as a teenager, and actually settled into a position of agnosticism when I, maybe not as a sophisticated expression of agnosticism as the one that you hold, Steve, but I wasn't really sure if God existed or not, and I didn't care. And it was really as a graduate student studying biochemistry that I became convinced that there must be a mind behind everything, because of what I would say, the design that I saw in biochemical systems, and what I see to be very real scientific deficiencies in chemical evolutionary models for the origin of life. And so that led me to the conviction there must be a mind behind everything. And that then led me on an exploration as to who is that mind. And I felt like Christianity offered the best explanation for not only the identity of that mind, but really the best explanation for the human condition.
Yeah, my background was non-religious. My mom was Jewish. My dad was Protestant. But I became a theist when I was 17. I was actually Mormon for a few years. What convinced me was an experience that I have, and we'll probably one day get into personal testimony, personal experience. Matter of fact, I had this discussion with Fuzz on Twitter not too long ago about personal testimony, personal experience, and what I called non-transportable justifications. And so I lost that over time, though, right? Because I had to reevaluate what my experiences was. But I definitely still hold the position that theists can be justified by personal experience. It's just not something that I hold to myself. And so, which kind of shaped me was I went to Christian groups, right? I mean, I went to these jamboree type things, but I never really felt connected to anything religious. I never felt like I had a connection to that. People talk about this one-on-one relationship with Christ. Never experienced that, to be honest with you. Even when I was Mormon, never had anything like that. Maybe if I had, maybe I would still be a theist, right? But when people talk about that, I would like to explore one of these days what people mean by that one-to-one relationship with Christ. And so myself, I've never had that. This is why I'm a non-believer. Well, there's many reasons I'm a non-believer, but that's why I don't hold to Christianity, at least. But I think that was the last question.
Yeah. So I guess we need to wrap this thing up. It looks like the show is about to come to an end. Oh, and guess what it says? Don't say we're wrapping it up, because it means people will tune out. But don't tune out just because you heard me say we're wrapping it up, because we want to talk about what we're going to be doing next in the next episode. And we're going to talk about confronting the design argument with the challenge of bad designs. So I'm going to be a bit on the hot seat here, I think. as somebody that advocates a version of the design argument. And then also, please don't forget about the giveaway. Go to agreetoargue.com/contest to find out how you can win some really cool Agree to Argue swag. And then also, please go to the YouTube channel, Agree to Argue, and subscribe. And then also visit our social media sites, Agree to Argue or at Agree to Argue. And then also, if you don't mind, tell people about the program, and please, we would love to hear from you as well in terms of what you thought went well, what you think we could do to make the show more entertaining and make the show better. We'd love to hear about your ideas for future topics and future guests. And then I guess that's it.
Well, actually, don't forget, we're going to be doing some bonus segments.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, the good, the bad. We're going to call it the good, the bad, and the huh. And so Fuzz and I are going to kind of discuss in a very small segment that's going to be put on the channel, after we do these live things, talking about what we think are bad arguments and why, from our particular positions, why we think they're bad arguments. And this is going to be across the board. I think a lot of atheists have bad arguments. I think creationists, I think Christians, a lot of people have some bad arguments, and a lot of fallacious arguments as well, using fallacies. And so I think that by eliminating these bad arguments and focusing on the better arguments, this basically upgrades the level of conversation. You're not dealing with these just debunked arguments over and over again. Like you mentioned, Pascal's wager. Obviously, I don't think that's a good argument. But there's even worse ones out there, much, much worse arguments out there. And we're going to be discussing like those things in like 5-minute segments. So subscribe to the channel to kind of see those sometime after like this uploads. Oh, I guess I need to put my my personal information that people have been asking. You can find me on www.greatdebatecommunity.com. That's why I have a 3 a.m. philosophy blog. Again, as a layperson for philosophy, I just like the topic and I write about it. But I do have some pretty well-known philosophers that do read it and then give me critiques on it, good, bad, or indifferent. And then you can also find me on my own channel, Steve McRae, on YouTube, where like last night we did a wonderful show on C2020 F3 Neowise comet with the wonderful planetary scientist, mathematician, Lana Kurt-Knoll. So if you like science and you want to talk about philosophy, come visit me on Steve McRae, and we're going to have all kinds of cool stuff over there, hopefully coming up in the next month or two.
And then if anybody wants to learn more about the organization I work for, Reasons to Believe, you can go to our website, www.reasons.org. And then also you can follow RTB on social media at RTB_official. And then also we have a channel of Reasons. It's called Reasons to Believe 1, where we have a whole host of videos and other types of programming available for people to explore the intersection between Christianity and science. So I guess that about does it. So we're going to bring this first episode to an end. I'm glad that everybody took the time to join us, and hopefully you will agree to argue just as Steve and I have agreed to argue today.